All right, now we're ready to proceed with the implementation. I showed Claude Code in the terminal earlier, and actually that workflow works really well for a lot of projects. I mostly work in the terminal. However, for the purpose of the course, it's actually a little bit easier and nicer to show things here in Visual Studio Code. And they have a really nice integration there as well. So I use both heavily. You've probably used Visual Studio Code, so I'm not going to explain the IDE in detail. This should all look pretty familiar. Just make sure that you have the extension installed. So if we go to extensions, you see here Claude Code for VS Code. So as of right now, the latest version here is 2.1.69. This just came out today. They update it pretty regularly, so it's worth keeping this updated. Here we see the files that we added so far. So there's a couple different ways to open Claude Code here. You could click up here and click on Open Chat, and then click on the Claude Code tab here. You can also use a keyboard shortcut, Ctrl-Alt-B on Windows. That opens and closes Claude Code. You'll see here's actually the full history for this project. So here's the one that we previously ran in the terminal. And you see you can actually scroll back and see this all here as well. I'm going to start a new chat because we don't need this history here for this next step. Then maybe briefly show some of the options. This is very similar to what you can do in the terminal, but not exactly the same. So we can do /model, for example. As before, this allows us to choose between Opus and Sonnet and Haiku. You can also see usage information here, so the same information we saw in the terminal earlier. Initially, when they first released this extension, it was kind of lagging behind the terminal one, and it sometimes still does, but they actually catch up very, very quickly now. So I found it works really, really well right now. One more thing, when you go to the configuration, so again, that's general config, opens up this settings dialog here. There's a lot of different ways to configure this. The main thing that I like to change is I have the initial permission mode. I set it to accept edits, so I don't have to necessarily approve every individual file edit. And then for preferred location, I've set this to the sidebar. Another option, the default option, is actually to run it in the panel, so it would basically show up just like another editor window. So play with both, see what works best for you, but I really like the sidebar experience. That way I can have it side by side with file changes. So let's close this. Also note that normally when I'm coding, I would have a much bigger window. I'm using a bigger font and a smaller window right now for this recording. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to make sense of this in the video. It would be way too small. But yeah, that puts some constraints on my layouts here. So experiment, see what layout works well for you. This is what I'm using for the course. Okay, so here I have opened up our README one more time. The README actually includes the first couple of prompts. So for this one, if you want, you can actually just copy and paste it. Okay, so let's take a quick look at what our prompt does. Maybe taking a step back, this step is all about setting up our database foundation. We'll be using SQLite, which is a simple, lightweight, local file-based database. In production, my pipeline uses Postgres, but that's more complicated to set up, and SQLite will work just fine for our purposes here. We're also asking for Alembic. Alembic is a tool for managing database migrations. So every time we add new tables, new fields, and so on, we'll create a new Alembic migration and run it. And the run model is what we'll be using to track each pipeline run. So every time we run our pipeline from the command line, it will create a new run in the database. It'll execute all the different steps, and all of the different steps can be associated with this particular run. That's kind of how we tie everything nicely together. We're asking Claude to put the database setup in db/database.py, use a synchronous SQLite engine. That's really all we need here. In a full-blown production setup using Postgres, we might be using async calls, but honestly, with our pipeline, which is kind of sequential in nature, we don't really benefit from that, so synchronous is fine. We're telling it to put the database file into data/ideapipeline.db. Then we explain what this run model should look like, what fields we need. So we want an enum to track whether the run is in progress, whether it has completed, or whether it failed. And then some fields, mostly an ID, a couple of date fields, and status, and what step was the last step that was completed. So once we add a bunch of steps, this will be a nice way to see how far this run got. And it's very helpful for debugging and actually making it resumable as well. We're also using a repository pattern. So essentially for each model, we'll create a repository class. So for the run, this will be the run repository. The repository is sort of a facade that handles creating objects of that type or loading objects of that type from the database. So for our runs, we have a create function, we have a getById function, and an update status function. Last not least, we ask it to create a PyTest fixture for in-memory SQLite and to test each repository method. So setting a nice foundation so everything we write can be testable. We'll create the initial Alembic migration for the run model. And then this is a good practice as well. If you're lucky, it'll actually do this automatically because our Claude.md actually says that it should be keeping it up to date by itself. But it never hurts to be explicit about it. So we'll tell it to update Claude.md with the Alembic commands in the development commands section. So I realize this is quite a bit, and to be honest, later prompts will get simpler. In this case, since I know we're working towards a pretty specific solution, our first few prompts will be a little bit more prescriptive, so we can have the right foundation in place. Otherwise, things will diverge too much from the start, and you won't be able to follow along with your version of the code. But in general, some deviations are completely expected. That's kind of the nature of agentic engineering. It's not going to be 100% deterministic. That's just fine. But yeah, the initial prompts, don't be worried if you find that these are very, very specific. This will change later on. So I'm going to go ahead and submit this prompt. Okay, so it's prompting us with this dialog to see whether it's allowed to run this command. I will allow UV add SQL model for this project. You'll get a few more of these, so I'm just going to accept all of them. Now, for example, it's asking whether we can add PyTest as a dev dependency. So now it's going to run the first Alembic command to create the first migration to add the runs table. Now it's going to run the actual Alembic upgrade. So this is where it applies the migration to our database file. It actually caught an issue here, so it's fixing it right now. You also see that it's keeping its to-do list up to date. So at the beginning, it'll create a list of to-dos, and then as it progresses, it automatically checks things off. So it's now on the final step to update the Claude.md file. And there we go. It finished up. So there was just a couple of minutes. So let's take a look here at the summary. It says it added the dependencies, SQL model, Alembic, Pydantic settings, and PyTest as a dev dependency. And then it added or modified the following files. There's a large list here. So that looks very promising. You also see the same files here in the editors on the left, right? So we have a data directory that shows our ideapipeline.db. As a reminder, this is already in the git ignore file, so this file won't be committed to Git when you commit other files. Here in Alembic, a lot of this is boilerplate for managing your Alembic setup. The most important thing here is the actual Alembic migration. So each migration ends up here in this versions directory. So the first one here, we see the date that it was created. It has a revision ID. And then each migration has an upgrade and a downgrade method. So with Alembic, you can upgrade to the latest version of the schema, or you can actually undo a change and downgrade, or multiple even. So for the upgrade, this is where it creates the runs table. It has all the fields that we're asking for, adds a primary key constraint for the ID, and that's it. And for the downgrade, it basically just drops that table. There's an Alembic INI file. If we look at the pyproject.toml file, we'll see our new dependencies in here. Alembic, Pydantic settings, and SQL model. And then pytest as a dev dependency. That's all reflected in the uv.log file as well. That's where it keeps track of the specific versions that we're currently using. And then we have a bunch of scaffolding here in the source directory. So it created a module for the idea pipeline, and then we have submodules here for all the core files, including our models. So here is our run model, exactly like we asked about. So this extends SQL model, which in turn extends Pydantic. But these are models that can be saved to the database using SQL Alchemy. And then we have all the fields that we asked for. We have a settings file. So this is where we're going to add mostly settings that map to entries in the .env file. So you'll see here that we have the News API key. We also have the Gemini API key. And it also added the DB path in here. One thing to note here, it actually added this to make the database path configurable. And it went ahead and added the News API key and Gemini API key here. The other one that we need is the News API topic URI. We could ask it to add that, or we can actually just easily add it here ourselves. So there we go. I just added this field while we're at it. And then here under DB is all the database plumbing. So this is just the basic setup for SQLite. Here's the repositories file with our run repository and the methods we asked for: create, get by ID, update status. That all looks solid. And then we have pipeline. Let's see what it added here actually, because we haven't gotten to the first pipeline step yet. So yeah, the base is actually empty. The steps are empty. So it just added some empty files for now. So that's fine. Okay, so this will all get filled out later. And then under tests, there's a test configuration. This is where we set up the SQLite in-memory engine. This is actually really nice. In a way, this is much nicer or much easier than when you're using Postgres. But with SQLite, we can use a simple in-memory database. This is super fast, and you can easily test things that require database access. And then here's our first test, which tests the run repository. So we're testing that we can create a run, that we can get it by ID. We're testing that it correctly handles runs that don't exist, and so on. So let's actually run our tests to make sure they pass. So we have our terminal down here. Of course, you can also use a separate terminal. I'm mostly using this one here for the purpose of the course, so we can easily see everything at a glance. So if I type uv run pytest, it should be running our tests, and there we go. 6 tests passed. Okay, perfect. So I think Claude did a good job so far. We're going to actually commit all of this to Git. I'm going to do this here from Visual Studio Code as well. So I'll just click here on source control. This is probably all familiar to you already. We'll give it a message. Okay, so we're going to say initialize database, scaffolded project structure, and road first test. I'm going to sync this up as well to our remote repository, and there we go.